Archer. I think most people are slowly filtering in there. So my name's Rachel, and I work for the Nerve Centre full time, but run events as well for the Northern Ireland Science Festival. I'm just going to give you a wee quick overview of how the Zoom is going to work this morning. You'll see or this afternoon, I should say, you'll see at the bottom there's a chat. If you use the chat just to ask any technical difficulties or anything like that, but if you actually have a question to ask, there's a wee Q&A section over at the other side. If you just put your questions in there, and then at the very end we'll have a Q&A, a bit of time set aside to answer some of those questions. So yeah, so that's it. I am going to hand over to Chris now, and all over to you.
Thanks very much, Rachel, and thanks to all of you guys for taking the time out and logging in, and giving up of your time on a really nice sunny afternoon where I'm sure you could think of plenty of other things that would be better to do than sit in front of a computer. But yeah, and also just to extend my thanks to Willa Murphy for coming in as well from the School of English. But yeah, basically, the whole way I wanted to run this session was more like an interactive kind of Q&A, where you've had the opportunity to interact with those exhibits from this morning and the website, and hopefully that stimulated a bit of thought and some interest around the artifacts. And so hopefully as well, you get where we're coming from with this idea of a synergistic project between science, intertidal ecology, and the arts as well, in terms of Steinbeck and Ed Ricketts relations. So yeah, and so we're here absolutely available to discuss any concepts arising, or any scientific questions, or any questions about the literary connections to the work. So that's a little bit about where I'm coming from, and can I just pass over to Willa, just for Willa to give her own introduction, because Willa is actually...
Yeah, hi, and I want to thank Chris first for putting together such a great website for all of us to explore today, but also to make that connection between science and literature. And I think sometimes we think of scientists as working away in a lab and writers kind of in a tower or in a library, and maybe not really overlapping. And I think Steinbeck is such a great example of a writer who was deeply interested in the scientific method, you know, and trying to look at human life through the lens maybe of a zoologist or a marine biologist, as a way of thinking about, you know, this planet that we all share, the ways that we all are driven by appetites and the survival instinct. So he's part of that period of American writing that's interested in a thing called naturalism, which is kind of, you know, seeing human beings in terms of their animal instincts and survival instincts. But yeah, let's just open it up to some questions.
Yeah, sure. It's really cool to hear that, actually. Well, there's so many parts of that resonate with even my own experience as an undergraduate student, and it was something that we talked about in a little bit in some of the videos. You know, was the impact of Steinbeck on most of us growing up and going to school in Northern Ireland. I think it was a part of our curriculum. I remember doing Mice and Men from a GCSE English. I don't know, Rachel, did you do it yourself?
I did, yes, yeah.
What did you do? What was it?
Of Mice and Men.
Yeah, right. So you know the drill. And I remember, like, at the time thinking about this and going, you know, enjoying it, not really being that aware of enjoying it. And then years and years later, it was that the book Brusca and Brusca's Invertebrates, right? So it's an invertebrate zoology text, and there being these little like snippets of quotes at the start of every chapter, and one of them was the quote about starfish from Canary Row. And I remember looking at that in the book and going, Canary Row, yeah, I reckon it, or Steinbeck, and it reminded me of that. And then I remember going to the library and chasing it down, like in the olden days when you used to go to the library. And getting the text and reading the text and going, Steinbeck's so accessible and so immediately gratifying to read, you know, and these characters come into life, and then thinking a bit further about it and digging into it. And actually that's where this exposition about Ed Ricketts and the rest of it happened for me. So that was maybe God, I'd like to say it wasn't that long ago, but it's quite a long time ago now. Yeah, but the amount of satisfaction that I get from reading about their interaction is fantastic, particularly when you think about how long ago it was, now. I don't know, Willa, do you think about this?
Yeah, well, yeah, I was rereading The Sea of Cortez, the log, and at the end of that, the appendix is an incredible tribute to Ed Ricketts and to their friendship, and telling the story of how they met. And Ricketts really changed the way Steinbeck wrote, and their friendship was so deep, and they spent a lot of time just hanging out in the lab, surrounded by specimens from the tide pools, and talking about everything, talking about science, philosophy, music. And he says in that tribute, it was hard to know sort of, where one person's thought ended and the others began, because they were such close friends and they talked about everything. So Ricketts, in some ways is almost the co-author, I would say, of certain bits of Steinbeck's work. Certainly The Grapes of Wrath wouldn't be the same novel if he hadn't known Ricketts.
Completely. You can really see that, I think, in so much of it when you're picking back through, particularly that book, Breaking Through, the Catherine Rogers book about Ricketts, the transcripts and travelogue, basically, is you can feel the influence of when you see those ideas and those writings in isolation, and then you go back to Steinbeck. You absolutely, and I just can't help but think that the way of looking at and describing human relations and their interactions of the characters in the novels reflects something of the biological interactions and the rest of it that you see in the foreshore. But I love thinking about the Log of the Sea of Cortez as being like a classic kind of road trip novel, and it's when you read it and you really are carried along with that idea of like science. It's almost like, and it's not to denigrate it, it's like science that's driven by natural curiosity and what were they doing it for, and it's just like ultimately down to the idea of wanting to collect material and this personal quest, so there was it was so far outside of the establishment at that point, Ricketts, in terms of the scientific establishment, he was really driven by something else internally.
Yeah, exactly. And actually neither of them finished university. They were both dropouts. They were both bohemians in a kind of way, and they loved hanging out with just regular people. That's one of the great things about Cannery Row, which tells kind of the story of what it was like to hang out in Monterey at that time, in Ricketts' lab. And there was just a whole array of people, hobos and prostitutes and writers and painters, musicians, but all sort of brings ideas to the conversation. So again, the way that I guess for both of them, it was about curiosity, it was about exploration, adventure, rather than the idea of science as work or some kind of boring thing in a lab or duty. It was part of a great, as you say, a road trip of exploration.
That's the one that got me this morning thinking about it, and it really captures the sense of that place and time in a way that's kind of 10 years prior to the kind of Kerouac and the Beats and all this stuff. It's so much further ahead of the curve that it gives you a sense that this was going on anyway, and really that area of California, the Big Sur and Monterey, it just fantastic place of opportunity because of the lack of development, the lack of gentrification and all of the problems that would preclude something like that happening now,
Yeah, exactly.
So whenever the space on the shore would have been cheap and accommodation and where you could have had that kind of community established. Okay, what have we got? We've got a question here from Damien. Sorry, that's a really cool chat. I could go on with that forever. Damien, can you describe how different types of seaweed are adapted to decrease desiccation based on their distribution on the shore? Yeah, well, you could see that a little bit. Certainly what we've got on the north coast is like very much algal dominated communities, certainly in the sheltered areas, as compared to the animal dominated midshore communities in the exposed. But like an example of this, you might say like the algae that you'll find very high up in the intertidal, like Alba lactusa or intestinalis or porphyra, they're very thin membranes, you know, and they're very capable of losing massive amounts of moisture and then rehydrating quite quickly, as compared to some of the others that are further down the shore, like the fucoid algae or Haemophila and things like this. So yeah, or others like Pelvicia. So the channel rack, Pelvicia canaliculata, the one in the upper shore intertidal, it has kind of got a curled channels to kind of increase the capacity to retain water and stuff like this. You know, so there's lots of morphological adaptations within the algae to deal with different kinds of desiccation stress and stuff like that. I don't know. Does that make sense, Damien? Oh, sorry. Right, I see this now. I'm just clicking on your question. So only I can see Damien's question. So I need to read Damien's question out. Right. So in reverse then, just to give everybody else the benefit of a random answer, Damien asked the question, Chris, can you describe how different types of seaweed are adapted to decrease desiccation based on their distribution on the shore? Yeah. So their position relative to the immersion gradient that we were looking at. Yeah. There's an interesting bit there. It's certainly in the exposed shore. I was quite surprised by this, that you can actually see the color differences in the pixels from the laser scanner. You got to imagine that laser scanner, every point that is returned, what it's primarily interested in doing is calculating the distance so it can build up the morphology. But each point that comes back also has a color value associated. And if you look at that exposed shore map, you can see the algae, the color, the impact that the algae cover is having on the model. And that's quite an interesting idea. Anyway, so that's a good technical question. And this is something that's quite interesting, actually, that I'd written out a series of questions to myself, really, or things that I would have thought about. And one of them was very much to do with that, the role of technology in the process of interrogating the environment. So technology is providing us with the tools to be able to sense the environment and ask questions of it, but it doesn't create the questions itself, you know? So technology has a very important role to play in the way that we can measure change or understand processes, but it doesn't tell us what questions to ask, right? So it's important to remember that the technology is a tool, and that the ecological study and the way we approach it needs to utilize the tool, but not be the other way around, if that makes sense. Hey, that was a very science answer, was it? So anybody else got something? Or we go on back and rant about Steinbeck again. I think, do you know that point about coastal development and gentrification of space and like the democratization of space for coastal communities is a really important thing that we're seeing now, particularly more than ever. Like, I mean, I live up in Port Stewart. I live on the north coast, and Willa, so do you, you know, and even in the space of my lifetime, you've seen massive changes to do with just the affluence and the way that people are making use of this space. I don't want this to get too like kind of politically heated, but it's a really interesting thing to talk about, because in the Log of Sea of Cortez, that's explicitly made reference to in terms of the indigenous community, the indigenous population in Central America when they're moving through these spaces, and how they're interacting with people and what people's reactions are to them being there, you know, and that's a really interesting narrative as well. You know, well, what do you think about that? Or...
Yeah, exactly. And as you say, he was able to be in that Monterey area, kind of in its golden age, when you didn't need much money. He talks about how poor they were, but they had a blast. They were able to buy, I think it would say a gallon of wine for like 50 cents or something. And they could throw these incredible parties, and they were living right by the water. They could go out and collect these specimens, just walking out, and live right near where they're working. And it was just full of life, all kinds of different people, not just wealthy people.
Yeah.
Which is, Monterey now is just, if you've ever seen Big Little Lies, that show is filmed there. It's full of yummy mummies and the richest of the rich. And so it's not at all the same sort of place anymore.
But do you find that, like, I'm thinking of other writers from the, like, kind of relatively similar period, but like I was at Hemingway in Not an Immovable Feast. I'm trying to think, what's the one at the end where they're skiing? I'm trying to remember. Is it Farewell to Arms? I haven't read these for ages. But talking about like being in the mountains and enjoying the space, and then the fish. It's like the analogy he uses about a pilot fish, and the crowd of the rich following the interest to another space. And then once the space is then fouled by that level of, I don't know, development, I suppose, for want of a better word, it becomes unattractive to the original character of the place and the people that were there, like the artists, the bohemians, that community of the kind of pioneers have to move on. And it's like Berlin or New York, and very much the same sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, there's a great moment in Cannery Row, and it's talked about too in about Ed Ricketts, where they're actually talking about, bankers and lawyers and the professionals, right? And they're looking at them, and Ed Ricketts says, ornamentation is actually the sign of the extinction of a species. So the more armor you have around you, the more ornamentation, it's actually the sign that you are a dying breed. And he says, look at these tramps. They don't have anything, but they're probably be the ones that allow our species to survive, partly because they're not full of anxieties and worries about money. And so it's an interesting conversation they have that connects all of that with the survival instinct and the scientific method of thinking about who is the future of the human species, I guess.
That's really interesting. But the one about this I remember, and it comes back to that point about the science and where the interesting dynamic conversations happen in science. It's like, it's not necessarily always in the meeting or in the back and forth between academics through review or whatever. A lot of the time it's in the downtime, in between things, in those spaces when you're moving from one place to another. And that's where the more interesting conversations can happen. And sometimes those conversations turn into ideas for a new paper or a new line of research or whatever. So there's another question. And I can read this one out. This is from Lena McConville. Is there any effect on how species adapt with the increase of global warming? Any effect on how species adapt? In terms of, this is really difficult without being able to talk to, actually, hold on. I remember who said that you can do this, that you can turn the mic on so you can chat.
Oh, do you want me to turn?
Yeah, you can like activate Lena. Sorry, Damien, I should have done that to you too, but we can activate, although it's not by engineering that we can't see you guys or talk to you. So there's Lena. Lena, can you turn your mic on to ask your question yourself?
Yeah, so like with the way that they adapt to the waves and stuff like that, with the increase of global warming and the increase of like waves and sea levels, like how do they survive with the increase of temperatures or stuff like that?
Well, right. So that is pretty interesting. So from the point of view of the intertidal species now, think about the physiological stress that they're subjected to in the first instance, right? So, I mean, in a way, the species that are in the subtidal, that are close to the low water mark, are the most they have the most stable physiological environment. The species that exist further up the desiccation gradient are already better fit to deal with increased stress from desiccation and the things that that might introduce, like massive amounts of fresh water, huge thermal fluctuation, and all those kinds of things. So arguably, some of the intertidal species are probably better able to cope with the stresses caused by climate or increased wave energy, whatever. Do you know what I mean? Now, that's not to say that they're not still important structural forces, particularly for organisms that may be close to their thermal limits. You know, at certain times of the year, extreme extreme meteorological events like very heavy rain, really cold winters, or extended warm periods of summer, periods of warm weather in the summer could cause lots of problems like deoxygenation, or other problems like increased capacity for invasive species transmission, all kinds of different bits and pieces, you know. Does that sort of answer?
Yeah, thank you.
No bother. But so the intertidal species are probably primed to be more physiologically tolerant than, like, say, for instance, organisms that live in coral reefs where the temperatures are pretty uniform throughout the year, you know, and the conditions are very stable. They would be much more susceptible to, I suppose, the idea of things like sea level rise or big changes in temperature. Sound.
There's probably a Steinbeck connection there too. Just, you know, he was interested in the migration of human beings in reaction to environmental disasters, you know, like the Dust Bowl. Yeah. And I'm sure he'd be very interested today to see, you know, the way that, you know, so many millions of people are being affected by the climate emergency. And I think we're going to see more and more migrations of people to more livable places on the planet, and how that will all unfold, and how people react to it, I guess, is the story to be written next. Maybe one of these listeners will become the novelist to write that.
Yeah, that's fantastic segue, because we have some of the research that we're doing in Ulster at the minute is looking at distributional changes in temperate fish stocks in response to climate-induced warming. So things that are moving poleward, you know, and we're also, the other thing I meant to mention earlier on, we also have a project on the go at the minute in East Africa, which is looking at traditional heritage knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge within maritime communities in East Africa, and what the inherent conservation value is of some of these practices. So the way people traditionally manage customary marine tenure and how they deal with the distribution of resources in a sustainable way, we have active field work going on there at the minute, in collaboration with the Kenyan Fisheries Marine Research Institute and the Institute of Marine Sciences in Zanzibar. So, like, it's a really, those are global issues completely, and people moving, mass movements of people, movements to the coast, to coastal cities, are putting massive burdens on some of these systems that are causing much larger problems, you know. But that's really interesting stuff while they're here. And it definitely relates to the Steinbeck thing, for sure.
Chris, do you think that the increase in transportation has had a big effect? You know, because obviously people can get to the coast a lot easier now, you know, and travel, and, you know. Yeah.
I'm thinking, like, very locally about the A26, you know, like increasing. Yeah, completely. And something that's quite interesting is the Coastal Access Act in the UK and in Northern Ireland, about trying to open up some of these spaces to increase access for the public, is really good, but it's a bit of a double-edged sword in some ways, because it's great because it promotes accessibility and gives people a sense of ownership of the space, but it also then starts to change the way it's used and the human impacts on the space as well. And a really good example of this at the minute is to do with how people are using natural environments through lockdown, you know, how increased public access through national parks and things like this you know, can impact on the conservation designations and the management of those key features. So it's really difficult, and it's very hard to understand what's going to happen at the far end of lockdown. Is if people are going to go stop putting so much pressure on those resources and go back to shopping, or what the longer term implications are, you know. But
they'll be going back to the pub, Chris.
I reckon, but you know, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it'd be good to, like, it's funny because I was on Portchurch Strand yesterday, and the amount of human traffic on the beach relative to this time last year, relative to this time kind of anytime, it's phenomenal, you know, the amount of people. I'm sure you've seen this in the press or in social media and stuff like that. So definitely changes.
As an American, when I first moved here, I was frankly shocked that you're allowed to drive your car on the beaches here, because that would just never be allowed in the States, because the beaches are treated, you know, with a certain amount of respect and preservation, and that you would just not desecrate it by. And so I'm always still like at Benone when you see people racing up and down or treating it like a massive car park, which kind of destroys the whole experience of being on the beach.
But isn't it funny? And I remember this really clearly. When I was a PhD student, I did an internship at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute in Portland, in Maine, right? We were there for like 3 months. And I remember there was a cod population biologist, Graham Sharwood, and Graham, we had kids about the same age, and Graham goes, it took me, he said, oh, I'll take you guys to the beach one day. And I was like, oh, brilliant, you know, that'd be nice. So we had to go in the car, pack lunches and an esky and all this stuff. Took all the kids and went to the beach. And the beach was like, it would look like somebody's driveway, you know, it was just like some stones and there were so many people on it. And I remember like thinking, going, God, you know, you've driven miles and miles. It took hours to get there and it was horrific, like relative to the beaches that we're used to here. And it's just occasionally, well, not occasionally, a lot of the time we need to pinch ourselves and realize what amazing natural resources that we've got access to here. So for all of the kind of relative lack of infrastructure and other bits and pieces, we have a really amazing natural environment, you know. But yeah, I'm not putting a slur on the beaches in Maine, you know. There's really beautiful parts of Maine too, you know. Might just have been Graham's beach. Yeah, so what else have I got? Yeah, any more questions coming in there?
No more at the minute, no.
Okay, well, have you got any talking points that you'd kind of identified with that you thought might be?
I know I sent you an email of some, but I don't have it in front of me.
I have a sheet up in front of me here about a couple of things. I mean, and one of them is about that kind of idea to do with the destructive or disruptive thinking as an agent of stimulus for scientific thought, or for in literary terms or whatever. Like science, a lot of the time, the way that it works, it's very conservative behavior, like conservative with a small c, you know, in terms of its incremental steps, and it's not prone to confirmation bias, but like a lot of scientific kind of movement is cumulative in small steps. And that's why it's really nice to think about the position of somebody that's so far outside of that they're able to sometimes like see the wood for the trees, you know, and to welcome those dissenting voices, or to welcome conversations with opposing points of view, because that can be that's the dynamic interface where those interesting ideas are born, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Who's in the chat there?
This is Karen Wainwright, who actually I went to school with many years ago.
Oh, yeah.
So, what did it say there?
It says JS would love Maine because it's home to baked beans, which I'm sure he would have loved. From your chef from Pittsburgh. Splendid chat with the three of you. Thanks very much, Karen.
Yeah, Steinbeck wrote a lot about beans. That is true. The preferred food of the tramp and the hobo.
Yeah. I know, it was like I'm trying to think, what was the Woody Guthrie tune, the Hobo's Lullaby, that was in my head earlier on, actually.
Mm-hmm.
But I like that whole time, actually, and it comes back to another in between spaces thought that I have. I was an intern through the Marine Institute in the Republic years and years ago. I did a summer bursary with a guy, Turlough Smith, who's from Cavan, right? Lovely guy. And we worked together measuring prawn discards. And so this is a pretty bizarre anecdote, but I lived in Rossavale, I worked in Rossavale, but I lived in Barna, which is a small village outside of Galway. I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but
I know it.
Yeah, so at Barna, I used to get picked up at the crossroads at this junction. Every morning, Turlough would pick me up in the car, coming up from Knocknacara, and I would be standing outside and going to drive for half an hour through the Gaeltacht to get to the Galway Iron Co-op to measure prawns, to measure the carapace length of the prawns. So you had a pair of digital calipers and you'd measure the distance because there's like an allometric relationship between the size of the carapace and the mass of the prawn. So that was what I did for a whole summer. I just got picked up and taken out there to measure prawns, and I was stinking of prawns the whole time. And on the rare occasions like that, Turlough wasn't there. I had to go in public transport, and I remember getting on the bus that was used to take the visitors that were going for the Iron Island tours. So it was all like backpackers from all over the world, and I'd like get on the bus with a boiler suit, and it was covered in like juice from prawns and stuff. It was horrific. But it was a lovely summer. I remember it very fondly.
I bet nobody sat beside you in the bus.
No, people were terrified of you,
Prawn Boy. I think I heard about Prawn Boy one time when I was in Galway.
Yeah.
No, but it is true that I think one of the things Steinbeck learned from Ricketts was observing, not just sea life, but human life kind of with this detached, unsentimental sort of attitude. Because one of the things that I love about his writing is that it is never sentimental. I mean, he got that also from being a reporter, but there's a kind of detachment, as if he is the scientist looking at this from above, and he's kind of looking at these human beings in a petri dish or, in the lab, which doesn't mean he doesn't have affection for them. It's kind of, his writing is great because it's so deeply committed to, ethics and, trying to build a society that would actually treat people better, but it doesn't do it with any kind of sentimental, not with sort of crocodile tears or, it's just by telling the facts that he can make people feel something about the problems. Or does that make sense? But it does always feel to me like it's the scientific method, and it's quite slow and probing and patient. And I think he did learn that through working with Ed Ricketts in the lab,
I've just remembered why I was giving you that anecdote about the Galway Iron Co-op. Right, it was back in the day. There was a radio with a cassette drawer in it, and like when you're sitting measuring prawns all day by yourself, and this was before like iPods or mobile phones, there was one cassette that was on the shelf, and it was like Dylan's Blood in the Tracks, and I just remember it was the only one I had, and so it was like thinking about tracks, like railways and fishing. It's always the two things are so synonymous in my head. There's a load of really good questions just come in there.
Oh, great.
So what have we got here? I'll stack back up. Rachel Monaghan, are there any good books or podcasts you would recommend about marine biology or just ecology in general? Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry, I was hitting answer live.
Oh yeah, she's making me answer it live. Oh, I can't see it now.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I see it now, hold on. Are there any good books or podcasts you would recommend about marine biology or just ecology in general? Yeah, loads of books about, now, general ones to start off with. I think some of those, the Oxford University Press very short introduction series are good. It depends on the level you're at. If you're, do you want to, can you stick Rachel on the mic there?
Yeah, 2 seconds.
We've got 47 people in now. That's a lot of people. It must be the Americans are just waking up. Is that it?
That's right.
So welcome to everybody that's come in quite late on. Actually, we haven't really been monitoring the numbers very well. So is Rachel, can you speak now?
Yep.
Yeah, sure. Sorry. So thanks for your question. So what stage are you at yourself for?
So I'm studying AS biology.
Yeah.
So
Well, like I said, that a really nice general book about marine biology would be kind of one of the Oxford's very short introduction series, and the kind of the core text that we use for teaching marine ecology. There are quite a few of them, but the one that's my favorite because it's written with a very kind of UK centric Northwest European perspective is Mike Kaiser's book, which has just gone into the 3rd edition. There it is, actually sitting on my desk, right? Because I got an inspection copy of it. Is Marine Ecology, Processes, Systems and Impacts, 3rd edition. I don't get any royalties from it. I'm not an author, so that's an unashamed endorsement. But if you're just generally interested in marine biology or ecology, I would suggest that you focus less on the technical detail initially and more on kind of getting yourself inspired toward the subject. And what's his name? Is it about science or science in general? What was the famous entomologist, the American, it's Edward Wilson, wrote the book, what's it, Letters to a Young Scientist. I remember this has been a really good one that I recommend to first year undergraduates to kind of come in and really try and get fired up first of all. But yeah, so that or any of that Steinbeck back catalogue is a really nice place to start. But yeah, so at AS level, I know it's very modular and sometimes you have to do different bits and pieces. Some people don't do the ecological component, but you can absolutely have a read around. And another really, really good book, although he's quite a divisive author, I suppose, is Richard Dawkins. And Richard Dawkins' book, The Ancestor's Tale, is a lovely book. And it's really not, when you think of Richard Dawkins' writing, you can imagine it's quite confrontational. But this one isn't. It's like a reverse chronology taken from, I'm trying to remember the way around it goes, is talking like from the ground up in an evolutionary sense. The emergence of each different animal phyla in geological time. And it's really told through anecdotes and different bits and pieces. And I think it's a lovely book, It's quite an old one of his, but yeah. Is that helpful?
yes, thank you.
Oh, no bother. Right, so who else have we got? There were Brenda, I'll just read these out otherwise because I think it'll probably be quicker. Sorry, Brenda. Brenda, I got a question from you saying, my kids, Christopher 11 and Ruben 8, have a question. Why are there so few shells on the West Strand beach in Portrush? They rarely find any. Thanks. Great question, right? And something that's very interesting. Now, if you've spent time on the West Strand beach in Portrush, one thing you will notice there is that the sea wall that's behind it, right? So there's a hard engineering structure there that's really replaced the natural dunes that would have been behind it, which is now full of apartments and various other bits and pieces. And it's a great place to go for a walk, like a promenade. But the physical structures there have certainly had a very big impact on the natural processes. And rest assured, there are lots of shells further offshore, right? And again, as you move further around to the west, if you imagine Ramore Head is sticking out there like a breakwater, and that what's in the West Strand is kind of sheltered, I suppose, to an extent from a lot of the tidal streams that are flowing out in the bay. So it's a big complex system, but there are lots and lots of shells that are, and bivalve mollusks and things like that will be living further offshore, but their shells and material are not making their way back onto the beach because of the coastal processes, really. So like Port Stewart is good. If you go on to Port Stewart or Benone at this time of year, you'll find lots of different kinds of shells washed up from the Thames bank, like razor clams, like Ensis or Arctica, Icelandica, or some venerid shells, lots of stuff. But that's what's really cool is we can use the shells to give us some inference about the organisms that are living further offshore. And they may be contemporary shells, or they may be old shell lag from organisms that were alive quite a long time ago. But yeah, we're actually doing some work at the minute with a species called Arctica Icelandica. And that's the big kind of, the black shells that you'll find on Port Stewart or Benone. They're big, like a lot of times you would have seen them as ashtrays in people's houses. But these are like some of the longest lived organisms in the world. You know, I think there's a record of Arctica being, you know, up to 500 years old. I think the oldest recorded individual. So you can actually see evidence of past climate events in the growth rings, the concentric growth rings in their shells and stuff like that. So they're pretty cool as an organism that we have living close by. Also, I hope that's a helpful question. Let me see, what else have we got? A couple of great ones. Is plastic waste having a major impact on our sea species today in Northern Ireland? The answer is yeah, undoubtedly. Plastic waste been a big problem for a long time, and it's just getting a lot of publicity at the minute. Now, there's a colleague and a friend of mine, Manus Cunningham. I don't know if any of you know him. Manus is a PhD student who's just finished up in Queen's, I believe. He was given a seminar on this quite recently, but Manus has done a lot of experimental work on microplastics and how they may impact on marine species in Northern Ireland. And again, he's done some experimental work down in the South Atlantic around South Georgia and the Antarctic Peninsula. I saw a seminar he was presenting quite recently. Definitely somebody worth checking out if you're interested in microplastics in Northern Ireland. So yes, I'm sure the answer is yes, but as to what that might be thus far, we're not sure, I think. But it's certainly an area of active research at the minute. I've got another. Do you want to chip in something, Willa, about plastics or anything?
Well, just plastic bad. No, I'll leave the science to you.
Yeah, but
it is shocking how much you see on the beaches here, more and more.
But you know, yeah, I think there's a bigger piece, right? And what I don't understand is, from a personal level, why there is such an amount of litter in Northern Ireland at all. I just don't understand. It seems really bad relative to anywhere else that I've been in the world. You know, I can't understand it. And I do routinely come back to that place like Port Stewart Strand, say for instance, like in the height of the summer, you know, I'd be on the beach a lot of the time because it's close to my house. But, you know, you see like people just like dropping nappies out of the car windows and then driving off. And I just thought it's a strange one, right? But I don't understand what would need to happen in the public consciousness to change people's attitude towards litter and hopefully like increased awareness in the young generation coming through is going to make a big difference. But, you know, it is a really big issue for sure.
And McDonald's bags and takeaway bags.
Well, here's a pet peeve of mine at the minute, right? And this is during lockdown. Now, because a lot of the businesses are able to stay open to do takeaways, but and so people are getting takeaway coffee cups. And I'm seeing lots and lots of takeaway coffee cups being like jammed into bins, and bins are overflowing and the stuff, you know, but wondering why proprietors couldn't take a more active role in terms of trying to promote that idea to their customers, that going, look, you know, stuffing it or setting it on top of a bin around the coast, it's not going to deal with the problem, you know. So it's, if you can take your waste home with you, if there's not the facility for the council to try and process it. But that's just a pet nag of mine. So yeah, I have to chip it in there. But I guess it's thinking that the businesses must have some sort of responsibility about what's happening to their waste products at the far end, as well as it being down to the individual. But I don't know how you kind of square that circle. But
just on that topic there, Chris, Brenda has a question there. So she says, sometimes we do litter picks on the West Strand and we find a lot of polystyrene balls that are impossible to lift up. Is it from cheap bodyboards, and how can we get rid of it as it is so small?
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. It would be hard. Well, actually, that's what's interesting is Manus's paper that he was presenting was looking at analyzing the types of microplastics in a laboratory in a way that you could tell something about the provenance of the material. So, you know, the kind of microplastics can give you an insight into potentially where it might be coming from. And I know like a lot of those microplastic beads, like nurdles and things like this were a big issue in terms of cosmetics and things. How do you get rid of them as they're so small? Yeah, that's interesting. But Brenda, that could be the beginning of a new line of research that we should be looking to co-produce together, right? So a citizen science project that's looking at the amount of polystyrene like aggregated within pore space. You could go out and systematically sample sediment cores on the beach to try and find out if there are greater amounts of polystyrene in the West Strand and Portrush. And it might be a consequence of that, the interference in the coastal processes caused by the sea wall or something. You know, the same reason that you don't get the shells is the same reason why you maybe get the polystyrene balls. I don't know. Let me see. Who else have I got here? Oh, there's loads of good questions. I've got one there. What does your usual work day look like pre-corona? Yeah, it's mad. At the minute, I'm on secondment at the minute in the policy division within the Northern Ireland government, or within the Natural Environment division. So at the minute, I'm doing that, but I'm doing it from my house. But like pre-corona, it would be a mixture of speaking to researchers, I suppose, postgraduate researchers, teaching, but a large part of it's to do with personal correspondence. Now, it used to be a lot more active field work, but now it's increasingly lots more kind of dull stuff, right? But we've got some very interesting things coming up in the pipeline now. We have a cruise, a research expedition, which is kind of similar enough in spirit to the Western Flyer and the Sea of Cortez. We're heading offshore for 11 days on the Irish State Research Vessel, the Celtic Explorer. So I'm chief scientist on that, and we're going to have a team of 10 scientists on a 65-meter research vessel with a world-class ROV called the ROV Etienne, which is owned by University of Limerick. And so we're going out with this ROV, which is about the size of somewhere between the size of a small car, I think. It's probably a fair way to, no, maybe, or like a big chest freezer, somewhere in between the two. And it's got manipulator arms, and we can mount equipment and payload on it. And we're going out to a World War I shipwreck called the SS Justitia. And we are going to map this structure in its entirety as part of a project called Advanced Mapping of Complex Marine Structures. And then we're going to use the data. So we're using laser scanners, just like we're using in a terrestrial setting for this exercise, but we're going to be doing that underwater under about 80 meters of water to try and map a shipwreck. And then we're looking to see how organisms are colonizing this, why they're colonizing it in the way they are. And ultimately, some of the questions that we're asking are very similar to the questions that Ed Ricketts was asking with John Steinbeck, only we're doing it in an environment that would have previously been inaccessible to these guys. So in a way, the philosophy or the kind of inquiry that they were talking about is still really active, but it's active in new environments, like in the deep sea and in shipwrecks and hard to reach places that we can only get access to through technology. So that kind of, yeah, I don't know. And there's that one. And then there's another one in June where we're going to Rockall. So we're going to an area called the Fangorn Bank with Professor Louise Alcock from NUI Galway and Professor Kerry Howell from University of Plymouth. We're going out for 23 days to the mid-Atlantic to go to a place called the Fangorn Bank where nobody's really ever been before, on a cruise called Resources of Rockall. And that's a biodiscovery cruise where we're going to basically look and see what we can find, you know. So it's cold water corals and deep sponge communities, all kinds of stuff, but it'll be really quite pioneering. So very excited about that.
Wow.
Yeah. So I don't know, that's not a usual work day, but so it's a mixture of drudgery and excitement.
That's really good.
Let me see. Thanks, Rushing. That's really nice. Just thumbs up for the resources. Cheers. As I was saying at the start of the process, it's actually a lot of this stuff, it takes nearly longer to do the digital resources than it does to do the thing in real life. But the benefit is then we have them for posterity and other people can look through them after the fact. So, Oh, let me see. Though there was one thing another thing I wanted to mention there, which was really nice. We had a cruise a couple of years ago in 2019, and we had the opportunity. We were approached by a group that was headed up by Louise Manifold, who's an independent artist based outside of Galway, and she'd set up a project called the Aerial Sparks Initiative, and it was about trying to match up practicing artists with the chief scientists of different research expeditions. So we were able to take an artist in residence on board our cruise, which is kind of like an engineered version of the relationship between Ricketts and Steinbeck, to bring it back to that, you know. So we had an acoustic artist whose name is Robertina, and Robertina, I'm trying to remember Robertina's surname. It's really, really difficult to pronounce. Forgive me. Subjanic, right? And she was on the cruise with us for 15 days as an acoustic artist, and trying to produce a piece of work for the Galway 2020 Arts Festival that happened last year. So we had a bit of a kind of lineage of trying to reach out and think about interesting ways to have a different kind of point of view. And that led to loads of really interesting conversations, like around the dinner table on the ship, you know, in between the shift changes. You know, if you can imagine, like somebody that does sound installation artwork is talking to like some people that don't get out of the lab very often. And it was really cool, you know. And so we're continuing those discussions and hopefully trying to co-produce like some sort of an output related to that. But yeah, I don't know. But definitely we would see like there's loads of mileage for increased bits and pieces, which is what's Karen Wainwright is a good one. In your experience, what types of seafood should we avoid eating to prevent continued decline? Not sure if related to conservation, but curious. Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know. Well, do you have any? We were talking about eating oysters recently. Do you have anything you want to add on that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I've read quite a bit about fish farms, and I'm not sure they are the answer, because I think aren't there issues with them contaminating, you know, the wild fish if they get out or if they have contact. I suppose, you know, most of us eat way too much protein in general, so it seems to me the answer is partly that people need to think differently about their diets and not need to be eating meat and fish all the time, and maybe go back to some earlier way of living, which was, you know, people didn't used to eat meat except maybe very occasionally when, you know, you could hunt the one buffalo of the year or whatever. And I guess that's what a lot of the liturgical calendar is really maybe grafted onto that earlier way of being, where you had periods of fasting and periods of feasting, because we probably feast way too much now, which is not good for the environment. It's not good for our own bodies.
For sure. That's really cool. Do you know, and there's something I was talking about this yesterday with a colleague at Ulster, Sinead Fury, who's she works in hospitality and tourism and is very interested in food distribution networks and things like this. And we were talking about seafood, and it's something I'm quite actively interested in as well. But yeah, for sure, they're talking about locally sourced and local models of production being much more important to people now. And as well, like in Ireland, particularly, people have a really strange relationship to seafood. You know, like the vast majority of the stuff that's landed in Ireland is exported straight off. You know, it comes through our ports. But for a lot of people, and particularly our students that see some of the material, you know, when you've been on holiday in like Spain or Portugal, and if you're lucky enough to be able to do those things, you know, you go to the fish market and you're like, oh, look at these amazing fish. We never get anything like that at home. When you go up to the counter and look at the provenance of the material, like loads of it, like the vast majority of it is caught in UK or Irish waters, you know, but it's exported straight away because there's no domestic market, you know. So all of those.
Cod here, really, it's really just cod people want to eat here. on the whole.
But isn't that's funny? You know, it's like something that could potentially change in the future is people kind of like reaffirming their relationship with their native seafood. You know, I remember like I had an Erasmus student a few years ago who was we were out doing an intertidal ecology fieldwork, and he started collecting the periwinkles and putting them in a plastic bag to take home to like cook for his dinner, and he was doing it in the most unaffected way. He didn't even consider that it might have raised eyebrows. And then I had some of the Northern Irish students going, "What's your man doing?" And he's like, absolutely, he was collecting periwinkles to go home and cook them, you know, which was great. And, you know, not that I'm advocating everyone go out and start eating periwinkles, but the way that we look at the space that we live in and the resources that we have around us is very culturally dependent. And there's a lot to unpick there as well, you know. But that's a whole other series of questions. All right, what's going to happen here now? We're probably going to get turfed out. Rachel, are we? We've got.
Oh no, I'll just stop whenever I stop it. So.
Oh, okay. No, I mean we can keep.
Anyway.
No, I'm used to these things of being like turfed out after half an hour or whatever. But yeah, no, I hope that's interesting.
Chris, Roisin just asked a wee question there about the copyright of the materials. So she said that she particularly liked the rocky shores species list and the photos of the 50-centimeter interval transect. Would it be possible to have access of these for teaching AS ecology? Just wondering about copyright.
That's an interesting thing. So no, at the minute, yeah, I mean, we can discuss this kind of indirectly offsite, but absolutely, I'd be happy to try and do that as a resource. You know, the thing is that not purposely, there's a lot more material to support those photos. So the positional information, the absolute vertical elevation of each of the points, you know, I have a massive archive of data related to that. So the stuff that I've put in here is only like the tip of the iceberg. But yeah, it would very well lend itself to that kind of an idea, rather than suggesting to use it as it is. But I mean, absolutely, we can, if you want to talk about that with me and trying to build a teaching pack or something, we can sure discuss it with me offline, and we'll get something sorted out. But that's the spirit in which the stuff's provided for sure, you know. What else? Yeah, because it's much the same story with, like, I'd lean quite heavily on the what do you call it, the Field Studies Council, who had some old material that was quite general, and I basically requested permission to say, look, can I borrow some of this content to try and kind of use it to help build this architecture? And they're like, no, absolutely, with that attribution it'd be fine. Mm-hmm. Sound? What was the one about sea bass? Karen, you were talking about sea bass. Sea bass is a funny one, you know, because it's the same, you know, I always remember this as being on holiday, you know, and you're always offered kind of like gilthead bream or sea bass. And like, these are the two kind of like the battery chickens of the sea, you know, for want of something better. And it's like, but actually those in some ways are, let's say, probably the easier fish to cultivate that are potentially the less impactful. You know, like you see other markets that are emerging for people farming things that are a higher value, like tuna ranching or halibut. I saw aquaculture installations where people are rearing halibut in enclosures and then releasing them to try and grow them up because they're worth so much money. But very interesting stuff. And certainly, if you are interested in any of these things, particularly for you AS students, like take a look at the course. And this is not a shameless plug for the courses, but there's absolutely more information about the marine science program, and we do start to dig into those things in more detail and unpick them for sure. You know, so yeah, there's a lot of stuff to do in that space. Who else? Well, we're at 3 o'clock now. I'm trying to think. There was something else nice to try and kind of round this up.
There's one here, Chris, from Caitlin. She says, has there been any major cases of pollution due to litter and waste affecting the sea life in Northern Ireland?
Oh, can't. The one about lobsters. I'll come back to that as well. So the question about major pollution incidents.
Yeah, has there been big incidences that have affected the sea life in Northern Ireland? that you know of?
No, nothing particularly that I know of, like in recent history, and certainly like things. This is really interesting, but things like the European legislation, like the Water Framework Directive, and other mechanisms that mean that we're kind of much more held to account, or had been up until this kind of point of, and not to come back to the political issues again about Brexit and things like this. So how we continue to maintain good environmental status when we're not being held under the cosh of, I suppose, of those pieces of legislation, that's going to be a really interesting space to watch in future. But no, absolutely. I think the water quality has improved massively in Northern Ireland as a consequence of some of those mechanisms. You know, I remember whenever I was at school, I used to row on the Bann, the River Bann in Coleraine, for those of you that know it. And I remember being terrified of like getting the water in your eyes or in your mouth because of the amount of stuff that was in it. And we were all terrified of it. And I mean, by comparison now, like Belfast Lough, Larne Lough, or some of these kind of places, post not really like really heavy industry, the water quality has improved massively. And there was a really interesting article in the paper, I think maybe earlier last year, about the return of the native oyster to Belfast Lough for the first time in 100 years. They've started and they've returned of their own accord rather than being reintroduced. So that's a good indication that something's better. Let me see. Karen, quickly, lobsters were per people's food at one time. Absolutely. You know, they used to actually mash lobsters into the soil as fertilizer in New England. If you ever, a really good book as well to read about fisheries, if you're interested, is Mark Kurlansky's book Cod, and he describes the relationship between cod fishing and rum production and lobsters and all manner of other issues. It's a very good one, but to pick up. And Laura, you asked that question earlier, and I'm sorry, I meant to get back to that, was about, are there any factors which control what sea animals can live on the shore? Say, so above and beyond the ones that we looked at there today, meaning desiccation and desiccation, wave exposure, temperature, salinity, and nutrient enrichment. Brilliant example for us is where you have storm drains and runoff. You know, you can have enhanced production locally to places where fresh water that's draining from the streets may contain traces of contaminants or other kinds of additions, and that can change the distribution and the shape of what you're seeing. So yeah, another factor, stuff I didn't even mention in the talk or in the artifacts, were to do with, I guess, other celestial bodies' influence on tide. So we just really talked about the moon, but the moon is just one component of that picture. And obviously the whole thing is much more complicated, but hopefully that's enough stuff to give you a kind of, at least a taste to get you started. Does that make sense? Cool. Well, I think in the interest of everybody getting a bit of value out of the rest of the day before it, while it's still nice because it could be blowing a gale tomorrow. But like we say, if I'll stick my email address in here, actually, will I? GLE.
If you make sure it goes to the panelists and attendees, if you just click
on okay, hold on. It's good because I typed it wrong. Let me see. But yeah, no, please do. Anybody that's interested or has any other questions they want to follow up, I'm more than happy to kind of have a chat with you guys offline or however else you want to do it after the fact. And I'm sure, like, I don't know, Willa, what do you think about an idea like that?
Yeah, I'd be happy with that. You might have seen my cat there who is demanding to be fed, but it reminded me that in Ed Ricketts' lab, you know, he used to provide specimens to school biology classes, and he would pay 25 cents for cats to be delivered to the lab's door. So these kids in the neighborhood would like steal each other's cats and deliver them, you know, to make some money and then go down to the sweet shop with their 25 cents. So yeah, it's a nice little detail.
Absolutely.
But also, if I could just mention that we have a lot of other events this weekend for the Steinbeck Festival, music, readings, talks. If any of you is interested, you can find our website. We have a Facebook page, Steinbeck Festival, Limavady. You're welcome. Everything is free.
Yeah, and to add to that, that we were talking about the possibility of actually trying to put on a physical event on the shore at some point to do with that, to try and tie the two things together, and that's very much our aspiration, I think, at this stage. So you guys will be the first to know about it anyway through your participation here and your links. So certainly, if you're interested in getting more like that, just fire an email in, and we'll keep it on the back burner, if that makes sense. Yeah, so make sure, just like we're saying there, is to dig through the rest of the other information that's up there, particularly the stuff about the courses that we run in Ulster as well. And if you want any more direction in terms of the reading, even if you're not interested in doing that, you just maybe doing it recreationally, for sure, just give us a shout. But certainly explore. That's the really key thing, is for the scientists among you, is to encourage you to keep the breadth of your reading and not to just focus on the core texts. It's in that space between the things that we need to be doing, or where the real interesting stuff is, and I'm sure that that's absolutely the case. Our curriculum as students gets so narrow so early that you end up with these things that you might have really enjoyed, but you just never even be aware of in the future. And so, like Willa and myself, we talked about this before, that model of liberal arts education that you would get in the States, where, you could take an elective module as a science major. You might be doing biology, but you could do a module in contemporary American literature, which would be amazing, But for us, where the curriculum's so constrained and so focused on providing graduates to the job market, it misses a bit of that piece, So you can end up with people with very specialist knowledge that have a really kind of not a poor grasp of what's going on outside their disciplines. And we're all guilty of that, to some extent, but it's to try and keep the enthusiasm for the subject going, and sometimes looking outside your discipline is where that happens. Yeah.
Like Ed Ricketts.
Yeah.
Who Steinbeck says his mind knew no horizon. So he was interested in absolutely everything. I think that's what made him, such a great scientist.
Yeah. And you can really get a sense of that from his writing, is that he was very giving of his ideas, in terms of discussion. And that is so contrary to a lot of the way academia has gone because of competition within disciplines and chasing grants and chasing papers. So there's something really refreshing about that voice that's so kind of an outside voice, anti-establishment in a way, and just kind of out there, driven purely by intellectual curiosity, which is probably the right way to go.
Mm-hmm.
All right, guys.
Well, thank you so much.
That's probably a good place to stop. No, thanks very much, Rachel. Thanks for hosting. And apologies if I didn't get to your question directly there, but thanks very much for your time in terms of interacting with the material, and very much for your time in terms of engaging with us like this. It's been really nice. We've had a lot of people come through the mix there. So thanks very much.
Thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.
Cheers, guys.